On the morning of November 13th, 1958, a man named John was found dead in his hotel room in the Virgin Islands. He was 49 years old. He had arrived 2 weeks earlier with his third wife, Fanne, for what the newspapers would describe as a vacation. He was in good health, the authorities said. There had been no prior indication of illness. He was stricken at 5:30 in the morning in room of the Virgin Isle Hotel in St. Thomas, and by the time anyone could do anything about it, he was gone. The cause was a heart attack. The cause, more precisely, was what heart attacks are always the cause of: the accumulated weight of a specific life, carried at a specific pace, inside a specific institution, for a specific number of years. 49 years. The weight of being a Hearst. His name was John Randolph Hearst. He was the third son of William Randolph Hearst, the most powerful media magnate in American history, the man who owned 30 newspapers and 17 magazines and 8 radio stations and several movie companies and a castle on a hill in California that took 28 years to build and was never finished. He was the son people meant when they said, "one of the Hearst boys," without remembering which one. He was the son who was said, by the people who knew the family from the inside, to have the most operational talent of all of them. He died at 49 in a hotel room in the Caribbean, on a vacation with his third wife. None of the things he was supposed to do had been done yet. Now here is the question this video is going to answer. William Randolph Hearst had 5 sons. He named the second one after himself. William Randolph Hearst, Jr., who became editor-in-chief of the newspaper chain and won a Pulitzer Prize and carried the name forward in the way that a name like that needs to be carried. He named the twins Randolph and David for the family and for Millicent's family. He named the first one George for his own father, and he named the third one John. Just John, not William, not Randolph. Not any of the names that the Hearst dynasty used to mark the sons it intended to remember. John, a name that could belong to anyone. The question is whether that naming was an accident of birth order or whether it was the first statement about what William Randolph Hearst intended for the son who was not supposed to be the important one, and what it cost the man who spent his entire life proving inside the machine his father had built that he was. Drop your city in the comments. And if these stories matter to you, the ones inside the famous families, the ones about the people who were there but are not in the official history, subscribe. Now let us go back to 1909, to the 30-room apartment on Riverside Drive in Manhattan where William Randolph Hearst kept his family while he built his empire, and let us find out what it meant to be the third son. William Randolph Hearst built his empire on a single insight that he had understood before anyone else in American journalism had fully articulated it. People do not read newspapers for information. They read newspapers for the feeling that the information produces. He had understood this at 24 when his father, George, gave him control of the failing San Francisco Examiner as a reward for his insistent lobbying and as a solution to the inconvenient problem of a son who had been expelled from Harvard for sending chamber pots engraved with his professors' portraits to those professors' homes. He had taken the Examiner, circulation 15,000, financial condition desperate, and within 2 years had made it profitable by doing what Joseph Pulitzer had done in New York, but with more money and more aggression and less restraint. Giant headlines, lurid crime. Municipal corruption exposed with the relish of a man who enjoyed the exposure as much as the reform it was supposed to produce. Human interest, the story that made you feel something, whether the something was outrage or sympathy or the pleasurable horror of reading about a world worse than your own. He moved to New York in 1895 and bought the Journal and fought Pulitzer directly and won, not because he was a better journalist, but because he was willing to spend more money than any competitor could rationally spend, and because the formula he had refined in San Francisco worked even better in New York, where there were more people to feel the things the headlines were designed to make them feel. By 1903, he had newspapers in San Francisco and New York and Chicago. He married Millicent Veronica Wilson, a chorus girl, 21 years old, the daughter of a woman who may have run a Tammany Hall-connected establishment of uncertain character, at a ceremony in New York on April 28th of that year. He was 40 years old, He had been seeing Millicent since she was 16. The apartment at 137 Riverside Drive was the Hearst family's New York residence. 30 rooms overlooking the Hudson, furnished with the same acquisitive energy that would eventually produce the castle at San Simeon and the warehouses full of unsorted European art. Millicent managed it. She managed the children. She managed the social calendar and the charity commitments and the presentation of the Hearst family to the New York society that Hearst himself was too occupied with his newspapers and his political ambitions to consistently maintain. She gave him 5 sons in 11 years. George in 1904, William Jr. in 1908, John in 1909, and the twins, Randolph and David, in 1915. 5 sons. None of them graduated from college. All of them went into the family business. All of them spent their adult lives inside an institution that their father had built to a scale that no individual, including the man who built it, could fully comprehend, let alone the sons who inherited it. John was the third. He arrived in September of 1909, 14 months after William Jr., which meant that by the time he was old enough to understand the world around him, the hierarchy of the family was already established. George was the oldest. William was the one with the father's name. John was the one who came after those two, before the twins, in the specific position in the birth order that family dynamics assign its most ambiguous role. Not the heir, not the namesake, not the youngest, not part of the paired unit at the end. Just the third, the middle of the first 3. His father was rarely home. This is the central fact of John Hearst's childhood that every account of the family confirms. William Randolph Hearst was in his offices. He was at his newspapers. He was pursuing his political ambitions. The congressional seats he won, the mayoral race he almost won in 1905, the governorship he lost in 1906, the presidential nomination he tried for in 1904. He was in California, where he had inherited his mother Phoebe's estate at San Simeon after her death in 1919, and where the castle was being built according to his instructions, and Julia Morgan's architectural genius and the kind of sustained creative investment that requires the person at its center to be present. He was not in the 30-room apartment on Riverside Drive managing homework and meals and the specific daily labor of raising 5 boys. Millicent was there. This should be said clearly, because Millicent Hearst is one of the more underestimated figures in the history of the family. She was not simply the wife who was displaced by Marion Davies. She was a genuinely capable woman who built an independent life of substantial achievement, while her husband was building his castle and his affair and his political fantasies. She founded the Free Milk Fund for Babies in 1921. She was active in New York society. She raised 5 sons in the physical absence of their father and the institutional presence of his name and his expectations and the unspoken understanding that each of them was expected to become a functional component of the machine he was building. The machine required all of them. There were enough newspapers and magazines and radio stations that the Hearst Corporation could absorb 5 sons and give each of them a title and a function. What the machine could not do was give each of them the thing that the man at the center of the machine commanded by virtue of being who he was. The specific authority that attached to the name William Randolph Hearst, the authority that could only be inherited by one person, the authority that was already spoken for before John was born. John Randolph Hearst went to Oglethorpe University in Atlanta, not Harvard, where his father had gone before being expelled. Not Yale, where the families of his father's social world sent their sons. Oglethorpe, which was a small university in Georgia that had been founded in 1916, and that would over the following decades develop a respectable academic reputation. But that was not, in 1927 when John attended, the institution that a Hearst was expected to attend if the Hearst in question was one of the important ones. He did not graduate. Like his father, like all 5 of his brothers, the Hearst family's relationship with formal education was the relationship of men who had been given access to a resource more significant than any university credential, the resource of the family name and the family corporation, which would put them to work before graduation was necessary. His first assignment was Atlanta. He was put to work as an assistant to the publisher of the Atlanta Georgian, one of his father's newspapers, which had been acquired as part of the chain building of the mid-1910s and which sat in a city that was, in the late 1920s, one of the growing centers of the American South. He was learning the business from the ground up in the specific way that men of his class and his era were expected to learn business, not in schools, but in the operations of the enterprises they were eventually going to run. He learned fast. He was good at it. The accounts of his career that survive, the obituaries, the genealogical records, the corporate histories of the Hearst Corporation, consistently note this. He was said to have more operational capability than any of his brothers. This is the sentence that appears in every account of John Hearst's life, like a verdict that was delivered by people who were in a position to know, and that has been preserved because it says something important that no other sentence in the record quite captures. The most executive talent, not the most journalistic talent, that went to William Jr., who became a genuine newspaper editor and who won the Pulitzer Prize in 1956 for a series of interviews with Soviet Premier Khrushchev. Not the most public visibility, that went to Randolph, whose daughter Patricia Hearst would be kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army in 1974 and would become one of the most famous American news stories of the decade. Not the most comfortable relationship with the California world their father had built. That went to George and David, who settled into the West Coast operations of the corporation and ran them with the competence of men who had found their appropriate altitude. John had executive talent, the ability to see a complex operation, understand its moving parts, identify where the inefficiencies were and what could be done about them, and then implement those changes with sufficient authority and sufficient tact that the implementation actually worked. This is the rarest kind of organizational intelligence, and it is the kind that large corporations cannot function without. The Hearst Corporation had plenty of creative talent in its editors and its writers and its photographers. What it needed as it grew through the 1930s and struggled through the financial crisis that nearly destroyed it and stabilized in the wartime years and was reorganized after William Randolph Hearst's death in 1951, was the kind of operational intelligence that could hold the thing together. John was 28 when they gave him his first significant corporate role. He was appointed president of the Stuyvesant Company, a Hearst subsidiary that oversaw Town and Country, Harper's Bazaar, Home and Field, Connoisseur, and International Studio. He managed these titles with the competence that the appointment implied. He moved up. He became vice president of the International Magazine Company, managing Cosmopolitan, Good Housekeeping, Motor Boating. American architect and American druggist, he ran Hearst's radio operations as general manager for 3 years. He became president of the New York Journal in 1936, the flagship newspaper that his father had bought in 1895 and used to fight Pulitzer and build the empire. He became assistant general manager of all Hearst newspapers in 1941, a position he held until his death in 1958. He was, in the vocabulary of organizational management, indispensable. He was the son who was running things, actually running things, in the operational sense, not the titular sense, while his brothers held their positions and carried their titles and represented the family in the public roles that required a Hearst face and a Hearst name. He was doing this while his father was still alive. This is the detail that requires attention. John Randolph Hearst spent the years between 1928 and 1951, 23 years, building his career inside an institution whose authority derived entirely from one man who was not going to release that authority voluntarily and was not going to be gone until death removed him. The corporation that John was running operationally was the corporation that William Randolph Hearst was still, in the formal and legal and spiritual sense, commanding. Every significant decision required the approval of the man on the hill at San Simeon, who was being consulted by wire and telephone, and the constant stream of intermediaries who carried his instructions across the country and who returned to him with the reports of what the operations were doing. John was running it day to day. His father was the institution itself. This is a specific and uncomfortable position for any person to occupy. It is especially uncomfortable for a person who can see exactly what needs to be done and the authority to begin doing it, but not the authority to finish, because the finish requires the consent of the man whose name is on the building, and whose vision is on every masthead, and whose specific idea of what a newspaper should be, and what the corporation should value, and which direction it should move in, takes precedence over any operational intelligence that his sons can bring to the problem. John brought the operational intelligence. His father had the final word. John Randolph Hearst grew up knowing about Marion Davies before most people outside the family did. Marion Cecilia Duras was 19 years old and dancing in the Ziegfeld Follies when William Randolph Hearst first saw her from the front row of the New Amsterdam Theater in 1917. He was 54. He sent flowers. He arranged for photographs. He did the things that a man of his resources and his determination did when he decided that something was going to be his. And within a year, Marion Davies was his mistress, his project, his companion, the person for whom he founded Cosmopolitan Pictures and built a production studio on the MGM lot and promoted with the full weight of the Hearst media empire in ways that made editors across the country furious and made Marion Davies one of the biggest female box office stars in Hollywood. John was 8 years old when this began. He was growing up in the apartment on Riverside Drive that Millicent managed with the competence and the discipline of a woman who had decided, at some point in the mid-1920s, that her marriage was a formal arrangement, and that she was going to build her life within that arrangement rather than collapse against it. She founded the Free Milk Fund for Babies. She was active in New York society. She maintained the household and the children and the philanthropic profile that the Hearst name in New York required. His father was in California with Marion Davies, or in New York with Marion Davies, or in Europe with Marion Davies, building the castle and making the movies and throwing the parties that became the legend, Charlie Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks and Winston Churchill and a rotating cast of the most significant people in the world, all gathering at the Hill at San Simeon for the specific experience of being inside the world that William Randolph Hearst had built. John visited San Simeon. He sat at the refectory table. He ate the meals that were served under the medieval ceiling that his father had imported from a Spanish monastery. He was present for the entertainments and the conversations and the social performance of a man who understood that the gathering of significant people around his table was itself a form of power. That the people who had been to San Simeon were people who had been inside the sphere of the most powerful media figure in the country, and who would always carry that experience. He saw Marion Davies at the table. He saw the arrangement the family had accepted, the formal permanence of the marriage to Millicent, the practical reality of the life with Davies, the specific decision that had been made about how a man of his father's resources and his father's priorities was going to organize his domestic world. It is not possible to know from the available record what John Randolph Hearst thought about this. He left no published account of his relationship to his father's arrangements. He said nothing on the record about Marion Davies that has been preserved in any source that this account has been able to find. He carried whatever he thought about it in the specific silence that the Hearst family maintained about the things that were understood by everyone inside the family, and that were not discussed publicly, because discussing them publicly would have required a form of honesty that the institution the family served did not find useful. What can be inferred from the record is this. John Randolph Hearst spent his career managing, among other things, Cosmopolitan magazine, one of the original Hearst publications, also the name of the film production company that William Randolph Hearst had created specifically to make Marion Davies famous. He managed Cosmopolitan the magazine with the same professional competence he brought to everything else. The relationship between the magazine and the personal history of his father's most public relationship is a relationship that the professional and the personal dimensions of the Hearst family's world did not formally acknowledge. He managed it. He kept it running. He did not discuss it. This was the texture of life inside the Hearst institution for all of the sons. The things that were understood were not discussed. The arrangements that had been made were honored by being left alone. The empire was the empire, and the people who worked inside the empire worked inside all of it. The journalism, the magazines, and the radio stations, and the castle, and the affair, and the arrangement with Millicent and the production company that existed to make the woman the family did not formally acknowledge into a movie star. John ran the production company's parent organization. He ran the magazine that shared its name. He visited the castle where his father lived with the woman. He did his work. He did not discuss it. Citizen Kane opened on May 1st, 1941. Orson Welles' film about a media mogul whose life followed the trajectory of William Randolph Hearst's. The mining fortune inherited from a father, the newspaper acquired early and used to build an empire, the political ambitions frustrated, the castle built, the actress promoted, the isolation at the end. Infuriated William Randolph Hearst so comprehensively that he mounted a campaign against it that went beyond anything he had ever done against a competitor. He attempted to have RKO destroy the negative. He published personal attacks on Welles in his newspapers. He banned advertising for the film from every Hearst publication. He used the full weight of the machine he had spent 50 years building to try to prevent one movie from being seen by the American public. He failed. Citizen Kane was seen. It was immediately recognized as one of the greatest films ever made and has been called that ever since. John Randolph Hearst was 31 years old when Citizen Kane opened. He had been assistant general manager of Hearst newspapers for 4 months. He was managing the newspapers that his father was using to fight the film about his father. He was inside the machine while the machine was conducting its most personal and most public battle. Not a circulation war with Pulitzer, not a political campaign, not a financial restructuring, but a fight against a piece of art that had looked at the man who built the machine and described what it saw in a form that the man could not control. William Randolph Hearst could control what his newspapers said. He could not control what Orson Welles said. He could not control what the critics said after they saw the film. He could not control what the public thought when they saw it, which was that the portrait of Charles Foster Kane was a portrait of a man whose power had isolated him from everything that power was supposed to be for. The connections, the love, the simple human presence that no amount of acquisition could substitute for. John managed the newspapers while the newspapers were fighting the film. He kept the operation running. He did not make public statements about the film. He was not asked to make public statements about the film because the public statements were being made by his father, who was the only person whose statement on the subject mattered to the story the newspapers were telling. The film is still called one of the greatest ever made. William Randolph Hearst died in 1951. John Randolph Hearst died in 1958. Neither of them lived to see the full reckoning of what Citizen Kane meant for the legacy of the man it was about. The reckoning continued without them, as reckonings of that kind do. In the film schools and the critical assessments and the anniversary retrospectives and the ongoing argument about whether the portrait of Kane captured something true about William Randolph Hearst, or whether it was, as the Hearst newspapers insisted in 1941, a libel. The argument continues. John is not part of it. He kept the newspapers running while the argument was at its most intense, and then he died, and the argument went on without him. The marriage to Dorothy Hart in December of 1927 was the first of 3. Dorothy Hart was from New York. The wedding was in New York. John was 18 years old, possibly still at Oglethorpe, possibly just having left. And Dorothy was 19. They were young even by the standards of an era when people married younger than they do today. What they were specifically young for was the combination of the Hearst name and the scrutiny that accompanied the Hearst name and the particular pressures of a domestic life conducted inside one of the most visible families in American media. The marriage lasted approximately 5 years. Dorothy divorced him in 1932, citing extreme cruelty. This is a legal category, as was the case with most divorce proceedings of the era, that covers a wide range of specific realities. What the legal category does not preserve is the texture of what the phrase described. What happened inside the marriage that produced the citation of extreme cruelty, what the specific conduct was that Dorothy Hart was characterizing in the terms that the law of the era provided. Extreme cruelty, these are the words on the record. The specifics are not. What is on the record is the year 1932. The financial crisis of the Hearst Corporation was building toward its catastrophic peak in 1937, when the empire would be placed under the management of an outside committee, and the warehouses of unsorted European art would be opened for public sale. The relationship between John and his father was the relationship of a man who was running a division of an enterprise that was heading toward a financial catastrophe that the man at the top could not prevent, and that the men below him could not fully address, because addressing it fully required authority they did not have. The personal life of a man in that position in 1932 was not a life that was easy to maintain. His second marriage was to Gretchen Wilson in 1933 or thereabouts. The record on the precise date is uncertain. Gretchen Wilson was connected to the social world of the era in ways that the marriage announcement reflected without providing the texture of what drew them together. This marriage produced a son, John Randolph Hearst, Jr. Gretchen divorced John in 1938, citing whatever the legal language of that divorce required, and won custody of the boy. She later married Woolworth Donahue, a son of Jessie May Woolworth Donahue, who was a daughter of the Five and Dime founder, which connected her to a different dynasty of American commercial wealth. 3 marriages. The pattern that 3 marriages represent, in the context of a man who was described as having extreme cruelty cited against him in the first, is the pattern of a person whose capacity for public organizational effectiveness is not matched by a capacity for private relational intimacy. The Hearst family did not produce men who were easy to be close to. The man at the top had demonstrated this across his own marriage, the formal permanence of the union with Millicent alongside the 30-year public relationship with Marion Davies, the arrangement that required Millicent to accept a form of marriage that was a marriage in legal status and in the production of children, but not in the ordinary sense of a shared life. His sons had watched this. They had grown up inside the arrangement. They had been raised by Millicent in the 30-room apartment while their father was at San Simeon with Davies, and they had understood what was expected of them in the public dimension of their lives without being given a particularly clear model for what a private life was supposed to look like. John had the talent. He also had 3 marriages. He also had a citation of extreme cruelty in the first divorce. He was working inside a machine that asked everything of the people who operated it, and that had no mechanism for giving back what the operating cost. His third wife was Fanne Wade, who was with him in the Virgin Islands in November of 1958 when his heart stopped at 5:30 in the morning. The financial crisis of the Hearst Corporation in 1937 is the moment when everything John Randolph Hearst had been building was put in jeopardy, and then preserved and then reorganized in a way that would shape the rest of his career. His father's empire had been built on debt and on the assumption that the debt would always be serviceable, because the revenues from the newspapers and magazines would always be sufficient to service it. This assumption held through the 1920s, when the revenues were extraordinary and the pace of acquisition was correspondingly aggressive. More newspapers, more magazines, more radio stations, the castle at San Simeon consuming resources at a rate that even the revenues of the largest media empire in the United States could not fully sustain. The Depression changed the arithmetic. Circulation fell. Advertising revenue fell. The newspapers that had been acquired at the peak of the boom were not profitable at the bottom of the bust. The corporation that William Randolph Hearst had built as an expression of his vision of what American media could be was by 1937 expressing a different thing, the limits of what one man's vision can sustain when the economic conditions that made the vision possible have changed. The outside managers who took control in 1937 began the work of rationalizing the empire. Papers were sold. Papers were consolidated. The art that had been accumulating in warehouses was put up for public sale in an event that the newspapers of the era covered with the same sensationalism that Hearst's own papers had always applied to the spectacles of the rich. The man who had spent decades acquiring the objects of European civilization was watching those objects be auctioned to people who could afford them. John was running operations through all of this. He was in the machine when the corporation was being taken apart and reassembled by people who did not have his father's vision and did not need it, who needed instead the operational intelligence to make what remained of the empire financially viable. John had that intelligence. He was brought fully into the operational structure not in spite of the crisis, but because of it. In 1941, 4 years into the reorganization, he was appointed Assistant General Manager of all Hearst newspapers. This was the role he would hold for the rest of his life, for 17 years, until the heart attack in St. Thomas ended everything at once. The role was not the top title. Assistant General Manager is not General Manager. It is the role of the person who does the work, while someone else holds the title that represents the work. In a family corporation, this kind of arrangement is common. The professional managers hold the executive titles because they have the credential and the board relationship and the formal authority, while the family members who have the operational intelligence do the operational work at a slightly lower level of formal designation. John did the operational work. He held the title that indicated the work without quite indicating the authority that the work actually required. He held this title for 17 years. When he died, the Hearst Corporation's board had to reconfigure itself without one of the people who had been central to its functioning for 2 decades. His branch of the family trust eventually passed to his son, John Jr., who became a company executive and director and represented that branch among the trustees. John Jr. grew up under an assumed name. This is the detail that sits at the end of the genealogical record, noted with the specificity of a fact that the record contains without fully explaining. John Jr., John Randolph Hearst II, was said by Forbes magazine to be living under an assumed name, perhaps to escape the confusion of having the same name as his uncle William Randolph Hearst Jr. and his cousin William Randolph Hearst III. The boy, whose father had been the most capable of the 5 sons, was living under a different name, having found that the name Hearst, the name that his grandfather had given to everything he built, was a weight he preferred not to carry publicly. The son of the son, William Randolph Hearst, refused to notice, was living without the name that John had spent his entire life trying to honor from the inside. The New York Journal that John Randolph Hearst ran as president from 1936 to 1937 was his father's first great weapon. William Randolph Hearst had bought it in 1895 as the Morning Journal, a failing paper that he purchased from John McLean for $180,000, and he had used it to conduct the circulation war with Pulitzer's World that produced the era of yellow journalism. The combination of sensationalism and human interest and manufactured outrage that Hearst had refined in San Francisco, and that Pulitzer had independently developed in New York, and that together they elevated into a style of newspaper practice that permanently changed American journalism. The Spanish-American War of 1898 is the war that Hearst's papers are most associated with in this context. The journal's coverage of Spanish atrocities in Cuba, some of it documented, some of it invented, all of it published with the specific intensity of an editor who understood that nothing sold newspapers like a war and who was not above contributing to the conditions that made the war possible, was the highest expression of yellow journalism's methods and the clearest statement of what those methods could produce when deployed at scale. Hearst always claimed more credit for the war than he deserved. The causes of the Spanish-American War were geopolitical rather than journalistic, but the newspapers that covered those causes and that amplified them with the specific energy that Hearst and Pulitzer were both applying were part of the environment that made the war thinkable. The famous telegram that Hearst allegedly sent to artist Frederick Remington in Cuba, "You furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war," may be apocryphal. The attitude it describes was not. John ran this newspaper in 1936 and 1937. He ran it in the middle of the financial crisis that was consuming the corporation William Randolph Hearst had built. At the moment when the empire was contracting and the question of which newspapers would survive was being answered by the outside managers who had taken control. The Journal was not the paper it had been in 1898. The circulation wars of the 1890s were 40 years in the past. The paper that had been the instrument of the Spanish-American War was now a New York tabloid competing with the other New York tabloids in a market that had been transformed by the Depression and by the radio and by the shifting habits of a readership that had been trained partly by the Hearst papers themselves to expect sensation and had become accustomed to getting it from a growing range of sources. He ran it for 1 year. He moved on to the next assignment, the radio operations, then the general management. The New York Journal continued. It eventually merged with the American in 1937, becoming the New York Journal American, which continued until 1966, when it folded along with two other New York papers in the newspaper strike that marked the beginning of the end of New York's great era of multiple daily newspapers. By the time the Journal-American folded, John had been dead for 8 years. The paper that his father had used to build the empire and that John had managed for a year at the peak of the empire's financial crisis was gone. The Hearst Corporation continued in the other directions. The magazines, the television stations, the business media, that the professional managers had taken it after the restructuring. The Journal was the most dramatic expression of what William Randolph Hearst believed journalism could do. John ran it for a year. It is one line in his obituary. It is the line that connects him most directly to the specific vision that his father had built the empire to express, and it is the line that most clearly demonstrates the distance between that vision and the operational reality of what running a Hearst newspaper in 1937 actually required. The vision was sensation and war. The reality was circulation management and advertiser relations, and the specific logistical challenge of keeping a daily newspaper running in a city with too many daily newspapers during the worst economic contraction in American history. John managed the logistical challenge. His father had the vision. The distance between those two things is the distance between the founder and his sons, measured in the specific units of what building an empire requires versus what maintaining one does. The structure of William Randolph Hearst's will was designed to prevent any single person from ever again having the kind of authority that William Randolph Hearst had exercised. This is worth stating directly because it illuminates something specific about John's position in the 7 years between his father's death and his own. The will created a corporation governed by 13 trustees, 8 professionals, 5 family members. The 8 professionals were a majority. The 5 family members, 1 son each, Kimi and Asim, had family representation, but not family control. The person who had held personal control of the entire enterprise for 50 years had arranged, in his death, to ensure that no one person would ever have it again. This was a recognition of what concentrated authority had produced. It had produced 30 newspapers and 17 magazines, and 8 radio stations and a castle that took 28 years to build. It had also produced the financial catastrophe of 1937, when the concentrated authority of one person's vision had extended the empire beyond what the economics of the era could support, and the outside managers had been brought in to save what could be saved. The 13-trustee structure was the institutional answer to the institutional lesson. It distributed the authority in the way that the authority needed to be distributed if the institution was going to survive the person who had built it. It was a sensible arrangement. It was also an arrangement that took the person who had the most operational knowledge of the institution, John, and placed him in a governance structure where his knowledge was 1 vote among 13. He was the best qualified person to run the Hearst Corporation after his father's death. He was one of 13 trustees. He was one of 5 family trustees. He was outweighed, in formal governance terms, by the professional managers who constituted the majority. He voted, he attended the board meetings, he brought his 17 years of operational knowledge to the discussions about where the corporation should go and what it should do and which newspapers should be sold and which should be kept and how the business should evolve in the years after the man who had built it was gone. He was present for the decision-making in the way that a trustee is present, influential, informed, relevant, and ultimately subject to the majority. He was the most capable of the family trustees. He had the most executive talent. He was 1 vote. He died with the restructuring incomplete, with the decisions not yet fully made, with the corporation still in the middle of the transformation from the empire that William Randolph Hearst had built into the corporation that the Hearst family would manage into the second half of the 20th century. The transformation continued without him. The professional managers who constituted the majority of the trustees managed it. The remaining family members cast their votes. John Jr. eventually took his father's seat on the board, living under an assumed name that was not Hearst, representing a branch of the family that had decided to maintain its institutional connection while releasing its public identity. The name that William Randolph Hearst had put on everything, on the newspapers and the magazines and the castle and the foundation, was the name that John's son preferred not to carry publicly. The legacy that John had spent his life sustaining was the legacy that his own child found, in the end, more comfortable to sustain from a distance. This is what dynasties look like from the inside, in the generation after the founder. Not the dramatic collapse of inherited wealth, not the scandalous dissolution of a once great name. The quiet adjustment, the professional management, the vote that is one of 13, the son who keeps the name, but not the publicity. The man who ran the operation dying at 49 on a vacation in the Virgin Islands, leaving behind a corporation that would continue and a name that would persist and a story that would not be told in any of the publications that carried that name. He was the son William Randolph Hearst refused to notice. He was there the whole time. The corporation kept running because of him, and the corporation never said so. Millicent Veronica Wilson Hearst outlived her husband by 23 years. She was born in 1882, a chorus girl's daughter from New York, and she died in 1974 at the age of 91. Having spent the last half-century of her life building, with the systematic energy of a woman who had decided what her life was going to be about, one of the most significant philanthropic careers in New York City's history. She founded the Free Milk Fund for Babies in 1921, the year that her marriage to William Randolph Hearst had settled into its permanent arrangement, the formal marriage in New York, the life with Marion Davies in California, the understanding between husband and wife that each of them was going to build an independent existence and maintain the legal connection, because the legal connection served both of them in ways that the alternatives did not. She built the Free Milk Fund into an institution that provided milk to poverty-stricken New York families for decades. She supported the American Women's Voluntary Services during World War II. She was active in the City Welfare Committee. She worked for the Salvation Army. She was, in the vocabulary that the New York social world of her era reserved for women of her position and her energy, a notable philanthropist. John grew up watching his mother do this. He grew up in a household run by a woman who had decided that the absence of her husband was a circumstance she could not change and a limitation she could not afford to accept, and who had responded to that absence by filling it with the most substantial alternative available to her. The creation of a public life of genuine usefulness, organized around the needs of the people in the city below the 30-room apartment on Riverside Drive, who needed things that the Hearst money and the Hearst name could provide. This was the model of domestic life that John had in the apartment, not the model William Randolph Hearst provided, the model of a man who had organized his entire existence around the expansion and expression of his own vision, who had made himself the center of everything, and who had populated that center with the people and the things that served his vision. The model his mother provided was different. It was the model of a person who understood that she was not the center, who had been positioned at the periphery of the institution that bore her married name, and who had found in the periphery not an exile, but a resource, the freedom to build something of her own at a sufficient distance from the institution that the institution would not absorb it. John had both models available. He was the son of the man who built the machine, and the son of the woman who built the milk fund, and the specific combination of those two inheritances is visible in the career he built. The operational intelligence applied to the father's institution, the three marriages that suggest the difficulty of building something genuinely private, inside the space that the father's institution had colonized. The absence from the public record of any Hearst-like project of personal expression or self-promotion. He ran the corporation. He did not express himself through it the way William Randolph Hearst had. He used it as the founder's instrument, maintaining and extending the vision that had been created rather than substituting his own, stewardship rather than creation. He had made peace with that role because the alternative, attempting to impose his own vision on the founder's enterprise, was not available while the founder was alive and not appropriate after he was gone. Millicent outlived all of it. She outlived the affair with Davies. She outlived the castle. She outlived the empire's financial crisis and its reorganization, and the war years, and the restructuring of the trust. She outlived her husband by 23 years, and her son John by 16. She was 91 years old when she died, and the institution that had been organized around the name she had taken when she married a 40-year-old newspaper publisher in 1903 was still running, still publishing, still carrying the name. She had kept it going, in her way, by keeping herself going, by not collapsing, by not being consumed by the arrangement, by building the milk fund and the war services and the philanthropic career and the independent life that gave the Hearst name in New York a dimension that it would not otherwise have had, a dimension of genuine public service, rather than simply the dimension of accumulated media power. John inherited something from her too, the resilience of it, the capacity to function inside an arrangement that was not entirely of your choosing, to find the work that needed doing and to do it well, to maintain a public competence that did not require the public to understand the private costs. He had 3 marriages and a citation of extreme cruelty in the first divorce. He died at 49. San Simeon is what people remember when they remember the Hearst family. The castle, La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill, sits on a ridge 5 miles from the Pacific Ocean on the California coast in San Luis Obispo County at an elevation of 1,600 feet. It took 28 years to build and was never finished. It has 165 rooms. It has an indoor pool tiled with Venetian glass and an outdoor pool modeled on a Greek temple. It has guest houses that are larger than most private residences. It has a zoo that at one point held the largest private animal collection in the world. It has gardens designed by a team of professionals who maintain them continuously throughout the construction period and afterward. William Randolph Hearst lived here with Marion Davies and entertained the celebrities and politicians and industrialists who were drawn to San Simeon's combination of extraordinary hospitality and proximity to the most powerful media figure in the country. Charlie Chaplin came. Douglas Fairbanks came. Winston Churchill came. Franklin Roosevelt came. A young John F. Kennedy came. The guest book of Hearst Castle is a roster of the 20th century's most significant figures, invited to the castle on the hill by the man who needed them to know that the hill was his. His sons came too. They came for the holidays and for the family gatherings that Millicent organized and that required the appearance of a family that was, in the ordinary domestic sense, not entirely a family. They came to the castle where their father lived with the woman who was not their mother, and they ate at the refectory table where Hearst sat at the center and directed the conversation, and remained, even in a social setting, the gravitational center around which everything else organized itself. John came. He sat at the table. He was a Hearst at San Simeon, which meant he was present in the court of the man who ran the empire and who also happened to be his father, and the relationship between the court and the family was never entirely separable from either dimension. He left and went back to New York and went back to the newspapers and went back to the operational work of running an empire whose center of gravity was still, even from a distance, his father at San Simeon. This was his life for 23 years, until the man on the hill was gone. The obituary that ran in the Oakland Tribune on November 13, 1958, described John Randolph Hearst as the assistant general manager of Hearst newspapers and one of 5 sons of the late publisher William Randolph Hearst. It listed his career in the order of the positions he had held: Atlanta Georgian, Harper's Bazaar, Cosmopolitan, New York Journal, the radio operations, the general management. It named his surviving wife and children. It noted that his funeral services would be held at St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue in New York, and that burial would be at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. 1,000 mourners attended the funeral at St. Bartholomew's. This is the number the newspaper provided. 1,000 people in a fashionable Park Avenue church for the man who had the most executive talent among the sons of William Randolph Hearst and who died at 49 on a vacation in the Caribbean, without having quite reached the altitude that the talent warranted. 1,000 is a significant number of mourners for a man whose name appears in very few histories of the Hearst Corporation, whose story is not told in the books about William Randolph Hearst or Marion Davies or San Simeon or Citizen Kane, whose legacy within the family organization he served is documented in the internal records and the genealogical databases, but not in the popular understanding of what the Hearst family was and what it built and what happened to the people inside it. The people who came to St. Bartholomew's knew they were the people of the Hearst Corporation, the editors and the publishers, and the executives and the managers who had worked with John Randolph Hearst across the decades and who understood what his operational presence had meant to the institution they were all running together. They were the people of the New York media world who had dealt with John across negotiations and partnerships and the ordinary transactional relationships of a man who ran the largest newspaper organization in the country. They were the people of his social world, 3 wives, which suggests a wide social range, and the children from those marriages, and the people who had been adjacent to those relationships across the years. They came. They filled the church. They buried him at Woodlawn in the Bronx. And then the history of the Hearst family continued without him, in the way that histories of powerful families continue without the members who were inside the story, but not at the center of the story the family chooses to tell. But the kidnapping of Patricia Hearst happened 16 years after John Randolph Hearst died. Patricia was John's niece, the daughter of his younger brother Randolph, born in 1954, kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army on February 4, 1974, from her apartment near the University of California, Berkeley. She was 19 years old. The kidnapping produced one of the most extraordinary American news stories of the 1970s. The heiress who was taken and held, and who appeared in photographs holding a weapon and calling herself Tanya, and who participated in a bank robbery, and who was eventually convicted of bank robbery in 1976 and sentenced to 7 years in prison before President Carter commuted her sentence. The story made the name Hearst famous in a new register. Not the yellow journalism in the Spanish-American War and the castle and the affair with Davies, but the kidnapping and the radicalization and the trial and the prison sentence and the eventual pardon by President Clinton in 2001. John was not there for any of it. He had been dead for 16 years when Patricia was taken from her apartment. He had been dead for 18 years when she was convicted. He had been dead for 43 years when she was pardoned. What the Patricia Hearst story does for the understanding of John's life is illuminate, by contrast, the specific invisibility of the path he took. Patricia Hearst is famous. She is famous for something that happened to her and for how she responded to it and for the legal and political aftermath of that response. She is famous in the way that Hearst family members have periodically become famous across the generations, for the intersection of the Hearst name and some dramatic external event. John was not famous. He worked for 30 years inside the institution that carried the family name, and he made the decisions that kept it running, and he died at 49 in the Virgin Islands. And 1,000 people came to his funeral at St. Bartholomew's Church on Park Avenue, and then the story moved on. His sister-in-law's granddaughter has a Wikipedia page with thousands of words on it. He has a Wikipedia entry with 1 paragraph. The paragraph says he was said to have the most executive talent. John was separately invisible. He kept it running. The institution never said so. The title of this video says that William Randolph Hearst refused to name this son. The naming is not the point. John was named. He had the family's middle name, Randolph, as his own middle name. He had the Hearst name itself, which was the name on every newspaper and every magazine and every radio station in the empire his father had built. He was a Hearst in the full formal sense. What he was not given was the specific naming that marked the son the family intended as its primary continuation. He was not William. He was not the son who received the father's own name, the name that carried the father's specific authority, the name that said, "This one is the one I mean when I mean the next generation of me." The naming is a shorthand for something larger. The thing larger than the naming is this: William Randolph Hearst built an institution so large and so centrally organized around his own specific vision that the sons he produced could all work inside it, competently and in some cases brilliantly, without any of them fully inheriting the authority that made the institution what it was. The authority was not transferable. It attached to the man. It was the authority of the specific combination of vision and ruthlessness and financial recklessness and journalistic genius that had produced 30 newspapers and 17 magazines and 8 radio stations and a castle that took 28 years to build. That combination could not be inherited because it was not a collection of skills that could be taught. It was a person. When the person was gone, the institution that the person had built continued in a different register, the register of professional management and family oversight, and the careful stewardship of assets that were no longer being aggressively expanded. John was the best of the sons at the stewardship. He had the operational intelligence to hold the thing together, to make the decisions that kept the machine running, to manage the relationship between the professional managers and the family interests in the way that a corporation organized the way the Hearst Corporation was organized needed to be managed. He was the most capable of the stewards. He was not, could not have been, the man William Randolph Hearst was. No one could have been. And so he ran the newspapers. He managed the magazines. He ran the radio operations. He voted on the 13-member trust. He went on vacation to the Virgin Islands with his third wife, and at 5:30 in the morning on November 13th, 1958, his heart stopped. 49 years old. He left behind 3 marriages, a citation of extreme cruelty, 4 children, 17 years as assistant general manager, 7 years as a trustee, and the specific institutional contribution of a person who kept the organization running for a generation after the man who built it was gone. He left behind a son who lived under a different name. The Hearst Corporation exists today as one of the largest privately held media companies in the United States. It owns newspapers, magazines, television stations, digital properties, and business media organizations. It is controlled by the Hearst Family Trust, which is organized according to the structure that William Randolph Hearst's will established. The 13 trustees, the family representation, the professional management. It is not what it was when John Randolph Hearst was running newspapers for it. The newspapers are a smaller part of the business than they were in 1958. The empire has diversified and contracted and diversified again in the specific way that media companies navigate the successive transformations that technology imposes on the distribution of information. The magazines that John managed, Cosmopolitan, Harper's Bazaar, Good Housekeeping, are still there, still carrying the Hearst name, still managed by the corporation that his father built, and that he helped hold together in the years when holding it together was the most important work the institution could do. His name is not on them. The name on them is Hearst, which is everyone's name in the family, and no one's name in particular. There is no Hearst publication named for John Randolph Hearst. There is no wing of the castle that bears his name. There is no endowed position at a journalism school. There is the genealogical record and the obituary in the Oakland Tribune and the Find a Grave Memorial in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, and the Wikipedia entry that describes him as the third son of William Randolph Hearst, and notes that he was said to have the most executive talent of all of them. He is the son William Randolph Hearst refused to notice, not the son he refused to name. He was named. He had it. But the name in the Hearst family, as in most dynastic families, was only the starting point. The rest of what the name meant, the specific inheritance of authority and recognition that transforms a name into a legacy, was distributed according to criteria that John Randolph Hearst never fully controlled. He had the talent. He did the work. He held the organization together for 17 years after it needed holding. He sat in the 30-room apartment as a boy, while William Randolph Hearst was at San Simeon. He worked in Atlanta and New York and wherever the corporation needed him. He ran the New York Journal that had been used to build the empire. He managed the magazines. He oversaw the radio operations in the years when radio was the most significant new medium available. He did all of this. He died at 49. The history of the Hearst family remembers the castle and the yellow journalism and the Marion Davies affair and Citizen Kane and Patty Hearst's kidnapping and the magazines that are still on the newsstands. It does not remember the man who kept the machine running while all of those more dramatic things were happening around him. That man was John Randolph Hearst. He was the third son. He was not the one the name went to. He was the one who made sure the name had something to go to. The newspapers remember him for one day in November of 1958 at 5:30 in the morning in the Virgin Islands when his heart stopped. 1,000 people came to the church. Then the story moved on. But John was there. He was always there. The machine needed him more than the story ever said.